Well, welcome into our third discussion of Brownfield's Drought in the Great Plains for 22. It's a roundtable discussion published every Wednesday. We've seen some widespread rainfall throughout the Western Corn Belt, and this could be our last discussion for at least for a while. I'm Kellen Havikin, an anchor and reporter based in Nebraska. I cover the great state of Nebraska as well as Kansas. And for our roundtable today, we've got Jaclyn Wilson, a cattle producer from Nebraska Sandhills, Brian Fuchs with the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Jeff Spieler, a technical agronomist for DEKALB Asgrow based in South Dakota. Everyone, appreciate the time here and glad that you've joined us and look forward to our discussions. Well, Jaclyn, I want to start with you. You guys are in the northwestern part of the state in Nebraska. Walk me through a little bit about what your operation does and how you guys have been dealing with the drought so far.
Sure, absolutely. We're a commercial cow-calf operation, and then we also do a direct-to-consumer beef business. But the drought, at first, it was looking really, really tough up in this area. We didn't get anything over the winter, hardly at all, just a little bit of snowfall. But in the last couple of weeks, we've been very blessed and have got some rain, which has sure perked everybody's moods up. But we're calving right now. I actually almost forgot about this morning. I was up on a hill, so I had to zoom back to the shop to get here. But what it's done in terms of changing our plans, it hasn't done a lot. And the reason being is because, like my dad always says, these things come and go, and sooner or later we will get rain. And so we do run long yearlings. We are just starting to take yearlings to grass. Yesterday was our first day of doing that. So, I did sort some lightweights off that are going to go to the cell barn here tomorrow. But for the most part, nothing's really changed. We're not looking at decreasing cow numbers, changing any of our yearling marketing. We'll kind of see what this summer brings. If that's the case, we might dump some yearlings earlier, pulling off the grass. But otherwise, our yearlings are our drought management plan. And so that really helps prevent us from having to do anything with our cow herd. The other saving grace for us is that we do calve later, so May calvers. So we spend a lot of time on corn stalks in the winter and are able to use that alternate forage and then come back to the ranch. And so fortunately for us, we don't utilize a lot of hay besides our background lot. And so our hay numbers, we didn't have to buy anything this year, which is great. It's probably the first year in a while we haven't had to purchase any hay. And so I think that's been great too. The biggest thing for us personally that we started about 2 years ago is started to do third-party drought insurance. We fortunately are in this quadrant that it does seem to pay off, and the program's really beneficial in terms of we don't have to pay premiums until September if we do have to pay premiums. So by the time September rolls around, usually we've already compensated for that difference. But I know in terms of March, April, going into that last week of April, where we're sitting at 0.32 inches, and our norm right now is 2.48. And so, we were significantly lower. But like I said, the last 2 weeks has really perked that up, and grass is finally starting to grow, though it is a little bit later than it usually is.
Yeah, Jaclyn, I was going to ask about that recent rain and kind of what its effects you've seen on the grass in your area. You touched on it, but I would like you to expand and tell us, how does that kind of maybe set you up for the end of May and into June?
Well, it sets us up great in a number of ways. First off, it's a mood improver, and I think kind of with everybody in ranching or farming, if you don't have moisture, you start to really start to think outside the box for all those marketing. But, we do winter graze a lot here. And so that's one of the big kickers that we were seeing when we were so dry last fall and over the winter. We were probably putting a little bit additional stress on pastures going in, getting a lot of that dead forage removed from our cows. They're pretty roughage finders. And so that was one of the great things. But the problem is you take away a lot of that dead vegetation and you hope that you have the new growth coming in. And fortunately we are now. But the biggest kicker, I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing is all the erosion from the high wind. We've got sand drifts, especially over on the background lot, that we haven't seen. Dad's talked about, he hasn't seen them in ages. And that's something new. I mean, we're going to have to run a blade on the outside of our bunks to remove the sand drifts. And so that's something that we've never seen. But, even night before last, there was a warning that went off in the middle of the night that we were getting some 80-mile-an-hour winds that were going through. And I mean, in these sustained, unprecedented, large, like really strong winds. This is completely unusual for what we see this time of year, and we've had it all spring.
And Jaclyn, we'll circle back to some of the things, at least that the erosion's presenting for forage management on your operation in a second. But I want to talk with Jeff here. Jeff, in South Dakota, South Dakota, excuse me. Tell me, what are growers that you're talking with, and what are you seeing in terms of drought? Maybe some potential relief from that drought. Walk me through what's happened there.
Yeah, so we're in the same situation, up until, the recent 2 weeks, we're in a really tough situation too, in terms of drought stress and it started last season, right? So we got some rains just in time last year to kind of keep us going, but going into fall throughout the winter, very little snow cover, very little early season rains, cold conditions. Drought was on the top of everybody's mind, but here again, in the last 2 weeks, that's really given a lot of relief. We've had significant rainfall, anywhere from, 2 to 5+ inches in a lot of the area that I cover. So significant change. Obviously, it's improving moods. Management, I would say, probably hasn't changed all that much because of it. You don't know if this is going to last. Our subsoil moistures, aren't adequate right now in a lot of cases. So it's still top of mind, but definitely better moods here recently.
How would you say with the planting pace for South Dakota? I know in Nebraska, if you were struggling in drought, they said we're not going to plant yet, and then now they're trying to get back in the fields and at least start, and then the rain obviously has held them off. How would you say that in your area?
Yeah, so in general, we're behind our average, right? So we're behind, and that's really mainly due to the cold conditions. Our soil temperatures were much colder than normal. Really, with the moisture wasn't holding us out of the field, which typically does in South Dakota. Really, that's typically the thing that keeps us out of the field. This year was just strictly cold conditions. We've got a wide range of start dates for guys. Some guys went out aggressively thinking, okay, these are dry conditions. My risk for, inhibitional chilling due to cold, wet soils is less because it is dry. I'm going to get out there and get started. We had a lot of that. We had some guys just completely hold off. There's a lot of, when you throw the dry on top of it, there's a lot of different decisions that have to come into place, right? So, especially with your small grains or soybeans, you want to get out there, get those planted in some moisture, right? Because if you get on the tail end of that planting window, now you're looking at a lot more variability in soil moisture in that top inch to 2. That becomes a big concern then for even emergence and things like that, and even in corn, right? So that's always a concern. So typically in drought, when we're dealing with severe drought situations, we're typically being more aggressive early, right? So getting things planted, we want to flower earlier when that comes around in July, things like that. So, but the cold has held us back a little bit, but in general, we're getting a pretty good push on it now. So,
Brian, I want to talk about the Drought Monitor and what your role is and what you guys do. One thing before we get into the some of the updated maps that we've seen, and obviously the most recent one will come out tomorrow. I'm curious, Brian, first off, how does the Drought Monitor, how do you come up with it? How is the content for it measured?
Yeah, so with the U.S. Drought Monitor, I am one of the authors and have been doing the map for a good part of the last 17 years. And what makes the Drought Monitor unique is we're not trying to replicate any one single drought index or drought input that's out there. There's a lot of information that's available to people, and what we're trying to do with the Drought Monitor is, instead of focusing on 1 or 2 indicators, we're trying to look at all the indicators and taking the best attributes of all those pieces of data and combine them into a single map. So in doing so, we look at both short-term and long-term indicators. We look at precipitation, we look at soil moisture, we look at satellite information, well information, modeled information, drought indices. There's a lot of information that comes together. And so a lot of these questions do come up as, hey, we had a rain, or we didn't get a rain. How come the map didn't change? And that's because we're looking at several dozen pieces of information every week, and we're not just focusing on a single one. And we understand that, of course, your snow and rain is going to make the biggest impact on the map, because it does impact many of the other pieces of data that we look at. But, we also have the other thing that's unique about the Drought Monitor is the weekly validation. So we go through a peer-reviewed draft process of the map. That there's several drafts, usually at least 3, sometimes 4 or 5 that come out each week. And we have a network of close to 500 people around the country, and they tell us what's going on in their backyard. So they look at the map drafts and they say, hey, we're wetter than what you're showing on the map and we need to show more improvements, or we're drier and here's the impacts that we're seeing on the ground. So we have this on the ground validation that's built into the making of the map each week. And in many of the states, I know we talked about Nebraska and South Dakota so far in this call, there are statewide groups that come together and they organize some information and data and push that up to the author each week. And it gives them a starting point. So they're not just, okay, where do I begin in Nebraska or where do I begin in South Dakota? There's a group that's coordinated in both those states. It's led by the state climate office that brings people from around the state together and puts up recommendations. And sometimes they even do a little sketch on a map of, hey, these are the areas that we think we should see changes. And then we can match that up when it gets across my desk as the lead author to really see what's going on and dig into the data a little bit more in the areas that have been highlighted for us for that week.
So I was thinking, I was paying attention last week. So we had all that rain over the weekend. And then I noticed the data goes through Tuesday. And then we see the drought monitor released on Thursday. So I was expecting some sort of reduction in the intensity of drought through South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas. And it came out and there really wasn't much change from the previous week. Brian, how does that shape up for what you may expect to see when the latest monitor is released this week?
Yeah, so like I said, we look at both short and long-term drought, and we try to show it on one single map. And if you notice the labels that are on that main map, you see S's and L's for short-term and long-term, and sometimes it's a combination of both short and long-term. But when we looked at the change map for last week, it looks like most of the changes in South Dakota were in the central part of the state, for the most part east of the Missouri River. And as we got into Nebraska, we had some improvements in the panhandle and the north central part of the state, and then some pockets of improvement in the east and southeast. And then in Kansas, it was mostly in the northwest part of the state. So we did have some improvement, and quite a bit of improvement, actually, when you think about how drought can move so slowly week to week. But when we're looking at that, I think it's been brought up by a couple of the other speakers already, is this dryness was just not, the last month or the last couple months. We can follow this dryness all the way back to late October is when it started. So we really missed out on a lot of that soil moisture replenishment or soil moisture recharge through the late fall and early winter months. And then again, we stayed dry through the winter, and most people saw, near record low snow amounts. And also, we had a milder winter where we didn't see that frost really digging deep into the ground. I know up in South Dakota, it was a little bit colder at times, but we really, in the Central Plains, we really were on the fringe of where the storm tracks were. They mostly were going east of us. And if you were south and west of those areas, you were warm and dry through much of the winter months. And that continued through the spring. So we really were trying to overcome a dry situation that had been building, which I would call long-term dryness. And it wasn't just, hey, we were a little late on the spring. And temperatures were mentioned as well. And coming across my desk, I had many people saying, hey, is this like 2012 again? Are we going to go right into this big, widespread, intense drought? And it was quite different than 2012. And the temperatures were the key. In 2012, we were really warm through the early spring. We had early green up. People were in the fields early. I know our pasture land in central Nebraska greened up the second week of March that year. And this year, the cold temperatures really suppressed not only planting, but really that green up of and moisture usage. So if we would have had similar temperatures to 2012 with as dry as we've been, the drought situation on the map would look very different than what it does today.
Brian, thanks for all of that explanation. Jaclyn, you talked about, okay, we had rain, things are greening up, things are good, but you mentioned the continuous problem has been erosion. What's the impact that you have seen from the drought and the winds in the sandhills with all of that? I think that for people who've never been there, who may be watching this, may think, well, sandhills all covered in grass or may have that. Walk me through the impacts that you've seen with erosion.
Yeah, I think the biggest ones we'll notice is on some of our trail roads out in the pastures. Definitely there's been some sand movement there. Fortunately, we do have a pretty intensive pasture rotation system. And so I think we've really worked on improving the quality of the vegetation over the years for especially for instances like this year, where we do all of a sudden have a lot of erosion. So those places that we do, we're trying to get rushes or slough grass down as fast as we can, putting cattle in and to make sure we have some compaction there to hopefully prevent any further erosion. But in all honesty, the places that I'm seeing the biggest erosion is just to the west of us, up around that Alliance area. Where a lot of the guys up there came in and bailed corn stalks off their fields, and then they're having a lot of dirt movement right now. I know there's been a couple times there on Highway 2, you drive into Alliance, you'll have almost a complete blackout from the flying sand. Fortunately, we don't have that. We haven't had those out here. Hopefully, we'll continue to avoid them. But like anything, it is what it is. It ebbs and flows, and you just handle it the best you can while it's here, and then hopefully things will kind of continue to turn around and improve, and the winds can go back to Wyoming for all I'm concerned right now.
You mentioned about the third-party drought insurance. Tell me, what is the program, and why did you guys enter it a couple of years ago?
So I think the program that the company actually just sold again, and I think now it's called like I'm gonna probably say it wrong, but I think it's AgriSimpro now is the company that we use. It's gone through a couple of different owners now in the last 2 years. The reason being is I actually had a dear friend of mine that was selling it, and I was something I wasn't extremely familiar with. I think ranchers aren't as familiar with as farmers, in terms of insurance purposes. And so, granted, besides stuff that comes through the FSA or some of the the drought programs that are passed down through the government, but I'd read. Truthfully, a couple of years ago, I'd read in a Working Ranch magazine about some third-party insurance that were especially being used down through the west part of the U.S., down in Arizona and New Mexico. And so I had a little familiarity with it, but she kind of came forward and said, hey, let's look at this. And I think the biggest kicker for me was that she went back, it was like 20 plus years of data that shown kind of where we were going to be at. But I think the biggest encouragement for me was just the fact that premium wasn't going to have to be paid up front, was due later. And it wasn't on a county by county basis. It was on a quadrant by quadrant basis, which to me was huge. And so because, sometimes it seems that there's certain areas that might, maybe a river or tree street, even a fence post might go through and change the amount of moisture. But we were in a pretty good quadrant. And so, we've had it, this is going on to our third year in the last 2 years where we've been we've been significantly below moisture based off of the drought forecast alone. And so it has definitely helped and allowed us to, purchase in some of those extra feedstuffs that we need, especially for the background lot.
Jeff, so farmers, whether they're in South Dakota or across the Central Plains that have been dealing with drought, they may have had issues with applying any sort of early crop protection tools. Walk me through what you're seeing and what should producers be doing right now in regards to that?
Yeah, right. So I would say probably, back to the temperature discussion a little bit, that's probably been the bigger challenge in terms of, guys going out and doing burn down applications, things like that. That's been ultimately the challenge, right? So, obviously when it's a drought scenario like we're dealing with, we're always, very aggressively in telling guys and working with guys, get out, get early on your burn down. Don't let those winter annuals get, out of hand. We want to conserve all the moisture we can, be aggressive, but on the same token, we're dealing like there again with the cold conditions that have kind of held us out a little bit. There's things you can do. Obviously, there's different products you can throw into the mix, right? And the soybean side of things, if you're, whether you're on the Extend platform, the Enlist platform, obviously there's other tools we have from dicamba and 2,4-D we can use for burn down to improve our performance there. There's additives we can use, adjuvants, to improve that performance. But there again, you still need that somewhat warm conditions for those plants to uptake that herbicide and get a good control. So I'd say that's been the biggest challenge. There's supply limitations with certain products right now that also come into play. The guys are looking forward, right? So if they're going to want to use products that maybe are short on their farm, from a post application down the road, they're kind of looking, okay, what can I substitute now? Or, am I going to throw some tillage into the mix where I maybe hadn't in the past? But there again, with the winds that we're talking, we haven't seen winds like this, in the spring, as far as, as long as I can remember, this is pretty significant. So, that's also making guys more hesitant, right, to do more tillage too, so it's a give and take there, but it's been a challenge.
So Jeff, moving forward, what's the answer? What's the recommendation now that, okay, we can plant, we're, second week of May. I mean, you're up against the clock, and for some, I'm curious, in this lens, what's next?
Right. So, when we do get a window, right? So we did get a little rain here over the weekend again. We're now getting to the point today where I think, in some areas we'll probably get planters rolling again here this afternoon. We had some sun yesterday, some wind. So yeah, we're going to be going full tilt again here. It sounds like come Wednesday night, Thursday, we got another chance. So it's go hard as long as we can. And, but really the management hasn't changed all that much, right? I mean, we're still, from a weed management perspective, like we're talking earlier, using the pre-emerge products as much as we can to take the pressure off that post application. That's, when we are short on products, and just in general, that's a good recommendation. Just take as much pressure off that post application as you can, using soil residual products now, overlapping those residuals, so we continue to keep those weeds, pressure low, so we don't put as much pressure on the post application. So that really hasn't changed. Fertility recommendations haven't changed all that much. When we do get in drought situations, the first fields that show that stress typically are the ones that are lower in fertility, right? So there's other management factors that come into play with performance with crops, that can be amplified under drought stress, whether you're not managing your insect pressure. We had, some spider mites last year. We typically see that in a drought year. Fertility, like I mentioned, if you're low on fertility, that stress is going to be amplified. So you want to keep, if there is drought stress, you want to make sure all your other things are in place as much as possible. So yeah, we're really not changing management strategy too much at this point.
I know some farmers I talked to last week, you get to the middle to the third week of May, concerns start coming up about losing yield loss because you've planted too late, especially obviously for corn. I'm curious, where are we at from your perspective there?
Yeah. So, we're in South Dakota, at least, we typically start to see, yield trend line yields drop off a little bit more as you get past May 15th, right? So that's when we start to see that peak yield level start to decrease more rapidly at that point. From a hybrid selection, soybean, variety selection, we typically don't change too much yet. Typically in South Dakota, that May 20th timeframe is when, if we're at the far end of our window for maturity, right? So if we're planting, let's say 100 to 112 day maturity, if we've got acres at that 112, 113 day at that point, and we're getting past May 20th, then we start to say, okay, let's take a look at it and maybe notch that down a little bit. If you're in the mid to lower end of your window for RM, we probably aren't going to change too much at that point, because we put that original hybrid out there for a reason, right? So based on soil type, based on performance, we don't want to change that right away. We don't want to get nervous on May 10th or May 15th and start idling that back and then lose our performance that we initially had planned for. So that's one thing to take into consideration. But on the bean side, yeah, we won't change maturity there until we get into June. From that standpoint, we just don't see the yield response when we do that. So guys are holding tight pretty well. It's the nerves start to set in. When you start to talk mid-May, that's when, especially around the 10th or 15th, that's when guys start getting nervous. So, but no, it's everybody's kind of staying on their original plan from that standpoint so far.
Brian, let's talk weather outlook. So we have, extended dryness. Now we have a week and a half now to 2 weeks of rainfall in the region. What's the outlook? What are you expecting there?
Yeah, so the Climate Prediction Center, which does the long range outlooks for the Weather Service, they come out with a monthly drought outlook and then a seasonal drought outlook. And when the monthly drought outlook for May came out, it actually did pick up some of this precipitation, and it showed through portions of the Central Plains that maybe drought intensity would ease or even see some improvement. So based off of that, we are seeing that here in May, and like folks have said, it's been a welcome change from where we've been. But on the longer term outlooks that go all the way through the end of July now, it does show that that drought footprint that we've seen through much of the spring pretty much stays in place. So these may be some short-term gains, but the drought is anticipated to really stick around at least through the most part of summer.
When you say that the drought footprint sticks around, are we talking just extended dryness, or are we talking the intensity of the drought that we're seeing?
Yeah, and that's the point that I can't predict. We may see some intensification, and we may see some drought plateauing and kind of just sticking the same level that it's at. That one's tougher to answer. So even with that outlook, they basically say drought or no drought, but they don't have the intensity really tied to it. My guess would be those areas that have seen the best rains and have had some of that moisture get into the deeper soil profile here in the last couple weeks, they're going to hold off on those longer term drought conditions, and then management practices as well, especially for our livestock producers. What pressure have they put on their pastures? What condition were they in with the drought, and how quickly they respond to these rains. And again, temperature is going to be a key with that. If we jump right into consistent 90-degree weather with wind again, we will be having a different discussion as far as drought goes.
We talked about that the dryness has gone all the way back to October. A lot of farmers say it's the driest year since 1893. Brian, we've been so far behind on moisture. How long is it going to take for us to catch up?
Going forward, normal precipitation would do a lot. If we get the timely rains and we don't get the heavy deluges that, 3 inches in 30 minutes doesn't do producers a whole lot of good. But if you had that 3 inches over 3 days, it's what do they call $1 million rain. So, it really is how that rain comes, how frequently it comes. What are those gaps in between those rain events? I think that's going to be key going forward. If we see timely precipitation through the region, I think the crops and livestock will be okay. But if we go with these long extended breaks again without precipitation, and especially if we see temperatures ramp up, it's going to be harder to sustain any positive recourse on the drought situation.
Guys, as we wrap up here, Jaclyn, I want to kind of start circling back here with you. What's the thing that you're watching this summer, and what have you guys learned from this period of drought?
I think what I'm watching is what Brian's saying, so I don't know if he's improved my mood for the day or he's made it worse, but I think that's just it. We're just continuing to watch exactly some of the things that he touched on. What's that pasture quality going to continue to maintain? Because I don't want anybody out here to get into a place where all of a sudden it's like, oh, I wish we would have done maybe our management style a little bit different. It's too late to go back and fix it. So just trying to stay ahead of the game, trying to think forward, thinking of, what's the summer look like in case it does get hot? What are we going to start marketing first? We actually are doing things in terms of marketing just a tad bit different. I'm keeping more replacements right now than I ever have. I'm hanging on to fall calves that I wouldn't have otherwise, just because I think as long as we've got some grass there, the longer we can hang on to them. And then in terms of the market right now, I think the better off it's going to be for us. And so, just continuing to kind of watch a little bit of everything but not make any rash decisions. So hopefully we'll continue to be kind of moving forward. But yeah, it would be nice to not have to do rain dances every week, because my dancing is not up to par for sure.
Jeff, same question to you.
Yeah, going forward, the optimism's pretty good. Obviously, with the commodity prices the way they are, growers' attitudes are pretty good right now. And which helps a lot, right? So they're driving as hard as they can. Like I said, when the conditions are favorable, they're going hard. They want to get everything in. Like I said, they're very optimistic right now, which they should be. But I see it. We have pretty good potential. We plan for the best, right? So I don't see a lot of changes in terms of guys, planting less density in their corn and things like that. They're optimistic, and like I said, we're still in a point, if we continue to get these small rains that keep us going, right? Last year we were in a situation where on July 1, I was about ready to tap out on some of our crop. I mean, it was really poor. And around the 4th of July, we got a little rain, and then it kept coming, and so it's just enough to keep us through. So we can make a pretty big crop on little rainfall. It's just got to be really timely.
Brian, from your perspective, what's the take-home point right now?
Well, I think there's been a lot of the plains regions, especially the eastern edges, that have really benefited from the last couple of weeks, and especially as you get into the central and eastern corn belt, there the wetness really increases. So I think we're really in that transition zone in the central plains that it really is going to take those timely rains, that precip going forward. The forecast is showing that temperatures are looking to be above normal through much of the summer. So right there is really telling us what our moisture usage, moisture requirements are going to be. But again, those timely precipitation events can do wonders, and it's really going to be summertime precipitation. It can be a lot of hit and miss events where these thunderstorms roll through one part of a region but not the whole region. So it could also turn into a little bit of luck from Mother Nature, right? That if you get those rains, your neighbor may not, and you could see two different situations in a short distance. So, optimistically speaking, you're right. We got to move forward. There's a lot of positives for this year for many of the producers, and that's the profession, and then just see what happens.
Guys, well, that's all that we have for today. Anything else you'd quickly like to add? Well, appreciate the time as always. Appreciated the discussion here about the drought in the Great Plains for 2022. You can find more on our drought series at brownfieldagnews.com. I'm Kellen Habekin, and this wraps up our roundtable drought discussions here at Brownfield. For Jaclyn Wilson, Jeff Spieler, and Brian Fuchs, I'm Kellen Habekin for Brownfield.